When money gets tight, the first instinct is often to pull out a calculator and start cutting. Writing for Vox this month, Anna North looks back at early 2000s frugality bloggers who turned extreme budgeting into a tool for taking back control. There is a natural impulse to try and spreadsheet away economic fear. But a stark contrast emerges when that desire meets the cold reality of 2026. A recent piece in The Conversation tracks the sudden spike in personal bankruptcy filings happening right now. Put these two perspectives together, and a clear tension appears between the comforting belief that a tighter belt fixes everything and the absolute legal finality of what happens when the math simply breaks down. Writing this August, as the price of a median home nears $500,000, Anna North looks back at a specific internet subculture from the Great Recession. She revisits the frugal sphere, early 2000s bloggers who mixed homemade laundry detergent recipes with extreme budgeting advice. Listen for how she frames these early coupon clippers. They weren't just sharing financial tips. They treated radical thrift as a way to reclaim personal agency against a bleak economy.
If you live in America in 2026, and you're not so wealthy as to be absolutely shielded from daily life, you're probably aware that everything is really expensive now. Gas and milk are both above $4 a gallon. Fresh vegetables are up almost 10% over this time last year, even though they will maybe give you explosive diarrhea. The median home in this country now costs almost $500,000. The early 2000s money trend that's still relevant today. The frugal sphere, explained. A lot of people, even those with relatively high-paying jobs, are very, very stressed about money. In some ways, our current unaffordable era is starting to evoke the years right after the Great Recession. Unemployment was high, the economy was bleak, and a lot of Americans, myself included, were searching for ways to do more with less. One distinctive product of these harsh conditions was an entire blogosphere that emerged to give readers chatty, relatable advice on saving money. It was a kind of the golden age for personal writing on the internet, and these writers melded advice and personal narrative in a way that foreshadowed today's influencers, but with a more lo-fi DIY aesthetic. Starting in about 2008 and continuing for the next decade, these authors reached thousands of readers a day with tips on how to spend less and sock more away. There was Mr. Money Mustache, a brash financial magician who had retired at age 30 and believed ordinary people could save half or even 75% of their income. There was Trent Ham of the Simple Dollar, an Iowa dad who shared his story of getting out of debt alongside recipes for cheap meals and homemade laundry detergent. There was my niche favorite, An English Major's Money, by a young woman who shared my less than lucrative career path, but who was nonetheless determined to achieve financial stability. It wasn't just old-school personal finance advice. It was a whole philosophical universe dedicated to the idea that by living on less, you could liberate yourself from the uncertainties of the economy and experience true freedom. Collectively, I like to think of these writers as the frugal sphere. Today, most of them are no longer blogging about saving money. Some have gotten jobs in traditional media, while others have gone on to other careers entirely, or simply enjoying early retirement. But their movement feels newly relevant today, as Americans struggle to afford necessities and face mounting anxiety over their economic future. So I decided to track down a bunch of frugality writers from that time and see what they had to say about 2026. One thing I wanted to know was why I wasn't seeing the same outpouring of money-saving advice I'd seen in the wake of the 2008 crash. But I was also curious for bigger insights. What, if anything, is the equivalent of the frugal sphere in today's inflationary era? And could the ethos of those optimistic coupon clippers give us smarter ways to think about the unsettling new place we find ourselves in 2026? What I found is that the frugal sphere still has lessons to teach us, but they're not about reheating leftovers or washing out Ziploc bags. Instead, they're about how to claim a sense of autonomy, even when our lives are buffeted by forces beyond our control.
The short, influential arc of the frugal sphere.
The idea that you can achieve prosperity by carefully watching your spending is far from revolutionary, and self-help authors were extolling the virtues of frugality long before the Web 2.0 era. In the 1990s, for example, editor Amy Dassey-Chin published a print newsletter called the Tightwad Gazette, teaching readers frugal tricks. Dassey-Chin herself favored reusing aluminum foil for the low price of $12 per year. But amid the upheaval of the Great Recession, when more than 15 million Americans found themselves unemployed in the worst crisis since the 1930s, a new generation of bloggers started offering advice about saving money, often directed at millennials starting their careers in a decimated job market. People were looking for something they could do, Nicole Deaker-Finley told me recently. What Finley did was to start posting all her earnings and expenses on Tumblr around 2012, when she was trying to make it as an independent musician in Los Angeles. She soon caught the attention of the editors of The Billfold, a website launched the same year to cover money with a personal, relatable tone befitting the times. Billfold editors Logan Sachin and Mike Dang shared their student loan and credit card debt. Finley tracked her net worth and spending and wrote about her quest for financial independence. She later went on to a freelance career writing about money, including for Vox. Kara Stevens, meanwhile, started the website The Frugal Feminista around 2012, while facing down student loans, credit card debt, and a tanking credit score. It clicked to me that if I didn't do something about it, I would be in this position of not being able to move forward in my life, she told me.
Based in New York City, she shared tips for finding free events, cheaper dupes of popular brands, and deals on fancy hotels. It was like, how am I living my Sex and the City life on a budget? Stevens recalled. As time went on, more bloggers joined the space, some of them already starting from a position of financial freedom. Christy Shen and her husband Bryce Leong started the site Millennial Revolution after retiring in 2015 at age 31 with a 7-figure investment portfolio. After 2008, people started freaking out and thinking that no job is safe, Shen told me. I think that's when people started being more interested in finance. The message of the frugal sphere was that if you could live cheaply enough and save enough money, you could weather any layoff and eventually not have to work at all. The bloggers of the era, many of them millennials aiming their advice at other millennials, tended to share a can-do attitude, a sense that with the right mix of care and planning, almost anyone could improve their financial situation. Also, they wanted to stick it to the man. The frugal sphere also had a tinge of rebellion about it. Americans tend to have a very up-down relationship with consumption, said Helene Olin, a longtime financial journalist and the managing editor at the American Economic Liberties Project, an anti-monopoly think tank. After 2008, the pendulum started swinging against buying stuff, and the frugality bloggers were leading the swing. Their implicit message was often that by refusing to buy expensive things, you were pushing back against corporations that wanted to control you. Frugality was, at least to some degree, about sticking it to the man.
At their peak, some personal finance blogs were reaching thousands of readers a day and breaking through into mainstream media. Shen told me that Millennial Revolution got 15,000 page views the day after a post about the virtues of renting a home was picked up by the CBC. Shen and Leung, as well as Trent Ham and other bloggers, got book deals and started to reach a broader audience. But the culture soon began to shift. The written personal blog began to die out, replaced by more visually driven social media, and an influencer ethos that rewarded the acquisition of new possessions, rather than showcasing ways to do without. Today, social media is much more about celebrating consumption than questioning it. On TikTok and Instagram, it becomes about showing perfection and showing a good life, Olin said. And part of a good life, as we define it in the United States, is spending money. How frugality lost its shine. Today, some frugality influencers have found a home on TikTok, and the de-influencing trend of a few years ago shows there's still an appetite for anti-capitalism, even in the age of short-form video. But overall, the cultural and economic winds have blown against frugality, frugal sphere writers and observers told me. As inflation rose in the 2020s, necessities cost more, but saving also became less attractive. More people made the calculation that if I don't take this trip this month, it'll be more expensive next year, Olin said. Upheavals like the COVID pandemic gave some Americans a grim outlook on money, Stevens said.
Their feeling was, there's no chance that any of us can be wealthy. What's the point of saving anything? Today, tips like making all your coffee at home instead of going out for a little treat don't resonate the way they once did.
This time is fundamentally different from 2008. The economy is nominally good now, and unemployment is low, but everything from eggs to real estate feels more unaffordable than ever. People say, the cost of living is so high, I need some joy, Stevens said. Like, you can't deny me everything. What the frugal sphere can teach us now. When I talk to frugal sphere writers about today's situation, I ended up realizing that even if some of their specific tips are no longer as applicable, their mindset still is. At its best, frugality advice was always about adapting to your situation, whatever that might be. When rice is cheap, buy in bulk. When basil is expensive, use the leftover pesto you froze in an ice cube tray. Nothing is cheap right now, and to be honest, I have never had the energy to freeze pesto, but the basic idea stands. Frugality to me means intentionality. Cara Stevens. Be flexible, Shen says. Millennial Americans once worried about their jobs being outsourced. Now workers all over the world are worried about getting replaced by AI. No matter what, though, you have to change with the times. For Gen Z, that might look like entrepreneurship and investing rather than a traditional career and saving for a home, Shen said. I can't yet imagine what it will look like for Gen Alpha, but there's something reassuring about the idea that flexibility is a skill we can learn, one that can help carry us through even the most macro of macroeconomic shocks. One big thing that's changed since 2008 is the politics of personal finance.
In the 2010s and 2020s, many critics of the frugality approach began to point out that without systemic change to lower the costs of housing, healthcare, and education, all the coupons in the world weren't going to make much difference. Today, affordability isn't just an individual concern. It's the cornerstone of a lot of political debates. But even as we look to systemic solutions, there's another big lesson Americans today can take from the frugal sphere. Control what you can. For Stevens, that looks like acknowledging that within any system that has a bias toward corporations or the wealthy, we understand that things may not be fair, she said. That also doesn't mean that you don't have personal agency. Exercising that agency might mean being more mindful around retail therapy rather than cutting it out entirely, Stevens said. If I know that I need these little quick boosts to make me feel good because work is stressing me out, can I carve out a part of my budget that allows me to do that without completely disrupting my financial goals? Stevens, for instance, cares a lot about her skin, so she spends money on skincare products that really work for her and cuts back on things like purses that don't matter as much. Frugality to me means intentionality, Stevens told me. It's about living more aligned with your values. In today's era of polycrisis, it feels downright insensitive to promulgate the idea that anyone can get rich with the right combination of tips and tricks. But most Americans make at least a few choices every week about where our money is going. If we can make whatever choices we do have in a way that's intentional, in line with our larger goals for ourselves and the world, maybe that's a 2026 version of financial independence.
Anna North leaves you with an appealing vision from the early 2000s internet. The idea that personal discipline can shield you from a terrifying economy. If you just make your own laundry detergent and track every penny, you can budget your way to freedom. But what happens when the math simply breaks down? J.L. Zagorski picks up right at the edge of that financial cliff. Where North looks at a cultural mindset of taking back control, Zagorski points at the stark legal machinery of losing it. He tracks the surging rate of personal bankruptcy, a system completely indifferent to how hard you tried to save. The interesting thing about reading these two back-to-back is how they expose the limits of personal responsibility. Next to North's optimistic coupon clippers, Zagorski's breakdown of state property rules, like how Arkansas lets you keep just $800 of your home's value after a filing, acts as a cold reality check. It suggests that surviving financial distress eventually stops being a lifestyle choice and turns into a brutal negotiation with the courts.
The number of Americans who file for bankruptcy is growing. More than 500,000 people took this step in 2025, nearly 50% more than in 2022. And the numbers have kept on climbing, with a 12% jump in June 2026 from a year earlier, as many consumers struggled to pay their bills. I am a business school professor who has researched bankruptcies, and whether, when you are at the end of your financial rope, bankruptcy helps or hurts. I became interested in the subject while in graduate school, not because of any courses I took, but because I ran out of money. While I was in grad school, my wife, who was keeping the family afloat, unexpectedly lost her job, at the very moment our savings went to zero. Ultimately, we didn't declare bankruptcy, and I'll explain later what we did to avoid it. But this near brush with that fate sparked my long-term interest in this predicament that befalls many American consumers who find themselves financially stressed out. What's personal bankruptcy? Bankruptcy is a legal process for people who can't pay their debts. Because it usually requires liquidating their assets or entering a repayment plan, Americans generally turn to it as a last resort. To declare bankruptcy, you first file a petition with a federal court, which appoints a trustee to oversee your case. But bankruptcy does not discharge all debts. There are 19 types of debts that even bankruptcy will not wipe out. Some of the bigger categories are alimony, child support, and most taxes. Student loans can be wiped out, but getting that done is difficult, and it's not an automatic part of bankruptcy proceedings. Two conflicting goals. U.S. bankruptcy law has two big goals that contradict each other.
The first is to give honest individual debtors a fresh start. The process ideally reduces or eliminates enough of their debt to make it possible to earn, spend, borrow, and repay money like people with a more typical financial life. In other words, personal bankruptcy can take the financial noose off debtors' necks. The second is to ensure that creditors get repaid as much as possible for their loans. When someone declares bankruptcy, some or maybe all of their creditors don't get their money back. In 2024, the Americans who filed for bankruptcy had about $75 billion in assets, but they owed their creditors about $86 billion, $11 billion more. States and the federal government make different trade-offs between these goals. As a result, there are very different limits on how much equity, the difference between market value and what you owe, debtors can keep in their primary homes and personal property after they declare bankruptcy. Some states are quite lenient. For example, Texas bankruptcy law doesn't limit the amount of equity in a home at all. That helps debtors get back on their feet. Other states are extremely strict in this regard. Arkansas limits home equity after personal bankruptcy to $800, and Kentucky restricts it to $5,000. This helps creditors. Lenders can force a debtor's house to be sold and keep much of the equity the debtor built up. Likewise, laws protecting vehicles and other kinds of personal property belonging to people who declare bankruptcy vary widely. Two types of personal bankruptcy. People declaring bankruptcy typically file using either Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code. About 2 in 3 people use Chapter 7, a form of financial liquidation.
The bankruptcy court appoints a trustee, who then sells off all of a person's possessions except what is covered by the various exemptions. The trustee then gives creditors whatever money is left after the sale. In exchange for giving up most of what someone owns, filing Chapter 7 wipes out almost all debts and gives them a fresh financial start. For people earning moderate to high incomes and whose debts are less than $2.75 million, bankruptcy courts make them use Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a slower-moving process. Creditors are paid over 3 to 5 years from a person's earnings. Debtors keep enough of their wages to cover necessary living expenses, but all other disposable income goes to creditors. Chapter 13 allows people to save their homes from foreclosure and keep their vehicles. Bankruptcy filing rising after decline. The number of personal bankruptcies filed annually fell sharply for more than a decade before the recent uptick, hitting a low of about 368,000 in 2022, down from about 1.5 million in 2010. That number has climbed steadily since 2022. A 2005 law called the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act sparked the earlier decline. Its goal was to make declaring bankruptcy harder and more expensive. Many creditors pushed for these changes because they felt some individuals were abusing the system.
The changes introduced income limits for eligibility to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. It also required people to get credit counseling before filing to see whether there was any way they could avoid bankruptcy. It also added a new obligation. Americans now take a course in financial management after they file for bankruptcy to reduce the chance of future money troubles.
One interesting study regarding the legislation's impact found that it lowered credit card interest rates, but it also prevented some people without health insurance from wiping out their medical debts. The 2005 changes caused the number of personal bankruptcies to plunge. That ended with the Great Recession, which lasted from late 2007 until mid-2009. This economic downturn pushed up the number of bankruptcies dramatically. But then the number fell from 2010 until 2022 as the Great Recession's impact gradually receded. The decline continued into the early 2020s because the stimulus checks and more generous unemployment insurance payments the government provided at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic helped keep millions of U.S. consumers afloat. The numbers began to rise again in 2022 as American consumers began facing increasing stress from income that has not kept pace with inflation and a sharp jump in credit card interest rates. Lasting changes. Bankruptcy stays on your credit report for up to 10 years. After that, creditors are supposed to treat people who filed for it like anyone else. A study I worked on with law professor Lois Lupica tracked what happened over 2 decades to both people who had and had not declared bankruptcy. We wanted to see whether those who had filed for bankruptcy really got out of their financial hole. Our findings were a good news, bad news story. The good news was that bankruptcy was not causing permanent financial stigma. The average person who declared bankruptcy eventually caught up financially with their peers who hadn't. The bad news was that it took 15 to 25 years to recover in almost all financial dimensions. This is longer than those 10 years that the bankruptcy filing stays on your credit report. In short, we determined that bankruptcy does give people a fresh start, but getting that reprieve takes longer than the law's intent. Strategies that can stave off bankruptcy. My wife and I avoided bankruptcy primarily by doing 2 things. First, we switched to using cash for most of our day-to-day purchases. When our wallets were empty, we were done spending. I talk more about this in my 2025 book, The Power of Cash. Second, we contacted the financial company where we owed our biggest monthly payment. After providing proof of financial hardship, they were surprisingly flexible. If these 2 steps are not enough for you, the next step is to consult an attorney who specializes in bankruptcy law. While there are lots of things most people can competently do on their own, filing for bankruptcy is not one of them.
What lingers is a collision between hope and arithmetic. There is a very human urge to tame an unforgiving economy by tracking every penny or washing out old Ziploc bags. That kind of extreme budgeting feels like a promise. If you just try hard enough, you will be safe. But then the math simply breaks down, leaving a bankruptcy judge to clear away the wreckage. The question left sitting in the room is this: when the money stops stretching, how much of survival actually comes down to personal discipline, and how much is just luck?